One month after my daughter's wedding, the photographer called me at 7 in the morning. His voice was shaking when he said Head noticed something terrible in the photos, and I needed to come to his studio immediately. He made me promise not to say anything to Jenna. My hands trembled as I drove across Portland, my mind racing through every horrible possibility. What could be so disturbing that Marcus would sound that panicked? Jenna had seemed so happy with Brandon. That perfect September day now felt poisoned by dread as I pulled into the parking lot of his brick studio building downtown. I pushed through the glass door and found Marcus pacing behind his desk. He was a man in his mid-40s, with gray streaks running through his dark hair. And Id hired him because he had won awards for his wedding photography. His studio walls were covered with framed portraits of happy couples. But the expression on his face that morning held nothing but distress. The smell of photo paper and chemical developer hung in the air as he gestured frantically for me to come look at his computer screen. Marcus had been editing the wedding photos for weeks, he explained, going through the hundreds of images Head captured during the ceremony and reception at Riverside Gardens. He always enhanced background details to make sure every shot was perfect. That's when he noticed her. A woman I didn't recognize, wearing dark clothes instead of wedding attire, appeared in multiple shots from different angles during the ceremony vows. He pulled up the first image. There she was, partially hidden behind a stone pillar in St. Mary's Church. Blonde hair, maybe mid-30s, with an intense expression that didn't match the joyful atmosphere around her. But that wasn't the disturbing part, Marcus said, as he zoomed in on her hands. She was holding a small recording device, pointed directly at the altar where Jenna and Brandon were exchanging their vows. In her other hand, she gripped what appeared to be documents or papers. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding. Id personally approved every name on the guest list. Id paid $40,000 for this wedding because I wanted to give Jenna the best day possible. My late wife Martha would have been so proud to see our daughter in that beautiful white dress. But who was this woman? Marcus clicked through more photos. The woman appeared again and again, always at the edges, always watching. In one shot from the parking lot before the ceremony, she was clearly photographing specific guests as they arrived. Another image showed her following Brandon's car as the wedding party pulled up to the church. My protective instincts kicked into high gear. Someone had been surveilling my daughter's wedding like it was a criminal investigation. I demanded copies of every photo showing this stranger. Marcus hesitated, saying he didn't want to get involved in something dangerous. But I convinced him this was about protecting Jenna. She was all I had left after Martha died from cancer 3 years ago. Id raised our daughter alone through high school and college, walked her down that aisle by myself, and I wasn't going to let anyone hurt her now. As Marcus burned the photos onto a disc, he mentioned one more detail that made my blood run cold. The woman seemed particularly focused on the section where Brandon's family was sitting. She'd taken multiple close-up shots of Brandon's parents, especially his father Gerald. Id met Gerald and his wife Helen several times during the 2 years Jenna and Brandon dated. They were polite but distant people, the kind who measured every word before speaking. Gerald owned Sutherland Properties, a successful commercial real estate firm, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of old money. Brandon worked for his father's company and seemed like a good man. He'd come to me before proposing to ask for my blessing, which Id appreciated. He treated Jenna well, made her laugh, supported her career as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital. But now, I was staring at surveillance photos from their wedding day, and nothing made sense. Marcus handed me the disc, and I was halfway to the door when he called me back. There was one more image he needed to show me. He pulled up a photo taken during the father-daughter dance. That moment when Id held Jenna close and whispered that her mother was watching from heaven and beaming with pride. In that photo, if you looked carefully through one of the reception hall windows in the far background, you could see the parking lot outside. The mysterious blonde woman was standing there in the darkness, and she wasn't alone. She was talking to someone whose back was turned to the camera, but I recognized the build and posture immediately. It was Gerald Sutherland, Brandon's father, having what appeared to be an intense conversation with the woman who'd been secretly surveilling my daughter's wedding. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel and trying to process what I'd just seen. The morning traffic rushed past on the street, people heading to work, living their normal lives. Mine had just tilted sideways. Why would Gerald be talking to a woman who was secretly recording and photographing Jenna's wedding? What possible reason could there be? I couldn't confront Jenna yet. She was so happy with Brandon, glowing with newlywed joy every time I talked to her. They'd just moved into a nice condo downtown that Brandon had purchased. Going to her with wild theories based on some photos would only hurt her, maybe damage her marriage, and I might be completely wrong about what I'd seen. I needed more information first. I needed to understand who Gerald Sutherland really was. I drove home to my quiet 3-bedroom ranch house in the suburbs, the same house where Eid raised Jenna after Martha passed. Family photos lined the hallway walls, memories of birthday parties and school graduations, and that last Christmas with Martha before the cancer took her. I'd been a high school principal for 30 years before retiring, and that job had taught me to gather facts before making accusations. I pulled out my laptop and started researching. The Sutherland Properties website looked completely legitimate. Office buildings, strip malls, luxury apartment developments throughout Oregon and Washington. Gerald's professional photo showed a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and an expensive suit. The company had been featured in business journals, praised for successful projects and smart investments. Everything appeared above board, but I kept digging. I spent hours going through newspaper archives at the downtown public library the next day, searching for any mention of Gerald Sutherland or his company. Most articles were positive. But then, I found something from 5 years ago buried in the Seattle Times business section. Sutherland Properties had been involved in a controversial land deal. Several small business owners claimed they'd been forced out through what they called aggressive and underhanded tactics. One article mentioned a lawsuit filed by a man named David Thornton, the former owner of a family restaurant. The lawsuit had been settled out of court, with no details released. I wrote down Thornton's name and spent the next few hours tracking him down through public records and social media. Head moved to Tacoma after losing his restaurant and now worked at a hardware store. I found a phone number and called, explaining that I was the father of a woman who'd just married into the Sutherland family. Thornton went quiet for a long moment, then said, if I wanted to know the truth, I should come see him in person. The drive to Tacoma took 2 hours. I told Jenna I was visiting an old colleague from my teaching days. The lie tasted bitter in my mouth, but I couldn't tell her what I was doing until I understood what I was dealing with. The hardware store sat on a corner lot, surrounded by strip malls and fast food restaurants. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of sawdust filled the air. I found Thornton in the lumber section, a man in his 60s, wearing an orange vest with his name tag pinned to the chest. When I explained who I was and that my daughter had married Brandon Sutherland, Thornton's weathered face went pale. He glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then told me to meet him on his lunch break at a coffee shop down the street. An hour later, we sat in a corner booth while Thornton told me his story. Head owned a successful Italian restaurant in Seattle, a family business his father had started in the 1970s. The building sat on a prime piece of real estate that Gerald Sutherland wanted for a luxury condo development. Gerald made an offer. Thornton refused because the restaurant was his life, his legacy. That's when the problems started. First came surprise health inspections that found minor violations Thornton swore had been planted. Then permit issues that shouldn't have existed suddenly appeared in the city records. Someone vandalized the restaurant 3 times in 2 months, breaking windows and spray painting the walls, but the police never found who did it. Business dropped as rumors spread about health problems and safety issues. Thornton's insurance premiums skyrocketed. His suppliers started having mysterious problems delivering on time. It was systematic destruction, Thornton said, his hands shaking around his coffee cup. Head tried to fight back with the lawsuit, hiring lawyers to prove Gerald was behind everything. But Sutherland Properties had a team of expensive attorneys who buried him in legal fees and procedural delays. After 18 months of bleeding money, Thornton had no choice but to settle. He sold the property to Gerald for a fraction of what it was worth and signed a non-disclosure agreement that prevented him from talking about what happened. But the NDA had expired 2 years ago, and Thornton said he didn't care anymore about the consequences of breaking it. He wanted to warn me. Gerald Sutherland was ruthless, he said. The man always got what he wanted, and he had no conscience about destroying anyone who stood in his way. I asked about the blonde woman in the photos. Thornton's face went even paler. He knew exactly who I meant. Her name was Carolyn Shaw, and she was Gerald's private investigator and fixer. She was the one who'd dug up dirt on Thornton's business partners, who'd found ways to pressure his suppliers, who'd manufactured evidence to support bogus health code violations. Thornton had heard rumors that Carolyn had even planted evidence to discredit other people who opposed Gerald's business deals. My stomach turned to ice. This woman had been at my daughter's wedding, recording everything, photographing everyone. What was Gerald planning? I thanked Thornton and stood to leave, but he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. There was something else I needed to know, he said. Something worse. Gerald didn't just destroy business competitors. 6 years ago, his own son, Brandon's older brother Thomas, had tried to leave the family business to start his own company. Gerald had seen it as betrayal. Head had Carolyn Shaw investigate Thomas, found some minor tax irregularities from years before, and Gerald had turned his own son in to the authorities. Thomas went to prison for 18 months. When he got out, his business was gone. His marriage had fallen apart. His reputation was destroyed. Head left the state and hadn't spoken to the family since. Thornton said Head heard about it through business circles in Seattle. How people whispered about the ruthless man who'd sent his own son to prison rather than let him escape his control. Thornton looked me dead in the eye and said if my daughter ever crossed Gerald or tried to take Brandon away from the family business, Gerald would destroy her the same way Head destroyed everyone else who got in his way. I drove home in a fog of fear and rage. The afternoon sun glinted off Puget Sound as I crossed back into Oregon, but I barely noticed the beauty. My mind kept circling back to Thomas Sutherland, the brother Brandon had never mentioned. The son Gerald had sacrificed to maintain control. What kind of monster does that to his own child? I needed to find Thomas. If anyone could tell me the truth about Gerald and what I should expect, it would be the son who'd escaped. I spent the next 3 days tracking him down through social media searches and public records databases. It wasn't easy because Head changed his last name to Thompson, probably to distance himself from the family. I finally located him living in Boise, Idaho, working as a freelance accountant. I called the number I found, and a cautious male voice answered. When I explained who I was and that my daughter had just married his brother Brandon, Thomas' tone turned hostile. He wanted nothing to do with anything related to Gerald Sutherland. I understood, I told him, but I needed to know what I was dealing with, because I had reason to believe Gerald was planning something involving my daughter. There was a long silence, and then Thomas said I needed to know the truth. He agreed to meet me if I could get to Boise. I told Jenna I had to attend an education conference, another lie that made me feel sick. But I couldn't tell her the truth until I understood the full scope of what we were facing. The flight to Boise the following week felt endless. I kept thinking about Brandon, wondering how much he knew about his father's activities, whether he was complicit or another victim. Thomas had suggested we meet at a diner on the outskirts of town, away from anywhere he might run into people he knew. I arrived first and sat in a vinyl booth, drinking weak coffee and watching the door. When Thomas walked in, I recognized the family resemblance immediately. He had Brandon's bone structure and Gerald's piercing blue eyes, but there was a defeated quality to the way he carried himself, like life had beaten the confidence out of him. He slid into the booth across from me and got straight to the point. Had grown up under Gerald's iron control, he said. Every aspect of his life had been managed and directed. Gerald chose which college he attended, what he majored in, what career path he followed. Thomas tried to be the dutiful son, did everything his father demanded, but he felt suffocated. He couldn't make a single decision without Gerald's approval. Then Thomas met a woman named Laura when he was 28. She was a third-grade teacher from a working-class family, and Thomas fell deeply in love. He got engaged, started planning a future separate from his father's expectations. Gerald disapproved because Laura didn't come from the right kind of family, didn't have the right connections or pedigree. When Thomas refused to break up with her, Gerald decided to handle the situation. Thomas' voice cracked as he described what happened next. Carolyn Shaw investigated Laura and manufactured evidence that she'd been involved in insurance fraud years earlier. The allegations were completely false, but they looked real enough that Laura was arrested. She lost her teaching job. Her reputation was destroyed. Even though the charges were eventually dropped for lack of evidence, the damage was done. Laura broke off the engagement to protect Thomas from more of Gerald's wrath. She moved to another state, and Thomas never saw her again. That's when Thomas snapped. Had watched the woman he loved be destroyed by his father's manipulation, and he couldn't take it anymore. He left Sutherland Properties and used his savings to start a small consulting firm. For 6 months, he thought Head escaped. Then, Gerald had Carolyn dig into his business finances. She found minor accounting errors, the kind of mistakes that happen in any small business and can easily be corrected. But Gerald reported Thomas to the authorities for tax fraud, making it look like his son was a criminal. Thomas went to prison for 18 months, while Gerald portrayed himself publicly as a principled man who reported crime even when it hurt his own family. Brandon visited Thomas in prison once, Thomas said, tears running down his weathered face. His little brother had apologized but said he couldn't go against their father. Brandon chose security and family approval over defending his brother. When Thomas got out of prison, his business was gone. His marriage had collapsed, and he had a criminal record that made finding decent work nearly impossible. Head moved to Idaho and changed his name just to have some peace. He hadn't spoken to Gerald or Brandon in 5 years. I asked why Gerald had been so extreme in his punishment. Thomas said it was about control. Gerald couldn't tolerate anyone in his orbit, making independent decisions or challenging his authority. He needed everyone around him to be dependent and obedient. When someone tried to break free, Gerald destroyed them as an example to everyone else. That's why Carolyn Shaw had been at the wedding, Thomas explained. Gerald researches and controls everyone in the family's orbit. He gathers information, finds leverage, prepares to manipulate anyone who might influence his sons or threaten his plans. If he'd noticed Carolyn at the wedding, that meant Gerald was already building a file on Jenna, gathering ammunition to control her if she ever became a problem. Thomas leaned across the table, his eyes urgent. I needed to get my daughter away from Brandon before Gerald decided she was a threat. Because once Gerald targeted someone, he didn't stop until Head broken them completely. I sat back, feeling dizzy. Everything I'd learned pointed to the same terrible conclusion. My daughter had married into a family controlled by a sociopath who would destroy anyone who challenged him. But before I could respond, Thomas pulled out his phone and showed me something Head kept hidden for years. It was a video recording from a hidden camera Thomas had installed in Gerald's home office years ago, before everything fell apart. On the screen, Gerald and Carolyn Shaw sat discussing what Gerald called the Laura problem. I watched in horror as Gerald coldly instructed Carolyn to handle it, to make it messy enough that Thomas would learn his place. When Carolyn asked if Gerald wanted her to go after Thomas directly, Gerald said no. You destroy what they love, he said on the recording. That's how you break someone permanently. Thomas will either come back broken and obedient, or hell leave broken and alone. Either way, I win. Thomas had never used the recording because his lawyer said it was obtained illegally and would hurt his case more than help, but Head kept it as proof that his father was a monster. He looked at me with desperate intensity and said, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. Gerald Sutherland would destroy anyone who threatened his control, including my daughter, and Head do it without a shred of remorse. I flew back to Portland that evening, my mind racing through everything I'd learned. I needed to talk to Jenna immediately, warn her about the family Shed married into, help her understand the danger she was in. But when I got home and checked my phone, there was a voicemail from her, and I could hear the excitement in her voice even through the recording. She wanted me to call her right away. She had wonderful news. When I called back, Jenna was practically singing with joy. She and Brandon had just found out she was pregnant. They'd been hoping it would happen soon, and now they were going to have a baby. Could I believe it? She was going to be a mother, and I was going to be a grandfather. My heart sank, even as I forced enthusiasm into my voice, and congratulated her. Now, Jenna was permanently tied to this family. A child meant she and Brandon were connected forever, regardless of what I discovered about Gerald. I couldn't just tell her to leave her marriage now. The situation was infinitely more complicated. After we hung up, I sat in my dark living room and tried to think strategically. I couldn't go to Jenna with theories and suspicions. I needed concrete proof of what Gerald was doing. I needed evidence solid enough that when I finally told her the truth, she'd have no choice but to believe me and take action to protect herself and her baby. The next morning, I hired a private investigator. I found Patricia Walsh through a recommendation from a lawyer friend. She was a former FBI agent who'd spent 20 years investigating organized crime before retiring to work private cases. When she walked into the coffee shop, where we'd agreed to meet, I immediately felt I'd made the right choice. Patricia was in her 50s, with sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. She listened without interrupting, as I explained everything I'd discovered about Gerald Sutherland, showed her the wedding photos of Carolyn Shaw, played her Thomas recording on my phone. Patricia took notes and asked precise questions about dates, names, and locations. She said she'd investigate Carolyn Shaw's current activities and see what she could find out about Gerald's business practices. She warned me it might take a few weeks and the retainer would be expensive, but this was my daughter's safety. I would have paid anything For 2 weeks, I maintained normalcy while Patricia worked. I had dinner with Jenna and Brandon twice, watching carefully for signs of trouble. Brandon seemed genuinely excited about the baby, talking about being a good father, about setting up a nursery in their condo. But I noticed he always tensed when his phone rang if it was Gerald calling. His whole demeanor would shift, and he'd excuse himself to take the call in another room. His voice becoming formal and controlled. Jenna glowed with happiness, talking about baby names and painting the nursery pale yellow. She was working reduced hours at the hospital because the pregnancy made her tired. Every time I looked at her, I thought about Gerald's pattern of control and destruction, and I felt sick with worry. Then Patricia called and said we needed to meet immediately. The urgency in her voice made my pulse spike. We met at a park near the river on a gray October afternoon. Fallen leaves covered the walking paths, and children played on swings in the distance, their laughter a sharp contrast to the heavy folder Patricia placed on the bench between us. Shed uncovered that Carolyn Shaw had been conducting surveillance on Jenna for months, she explained. It started even before the wedding. Carolyn had run a comprehensive background check covering Jenna's finances, her friends, her workplace, my financial situation. Patricia had found evidence that Carolyn had illegally accessed Jenna's medical records, probably through contacts at the hospital. But it was worse than that. Patricia had followed Carolyn for the past 2 weeks and discovered she was currently watching Jenna's clinic, photographing patients and staff, documenting everything about Jenna's daily routine. Patricia believed Gerald was building leverage, gathering information he could use to control Jenna if she ever became a problem for his plans. Patricia opened the folder and showed me what else she'd found. Brandon's trust fund had conditions I hadn't known about. If Brandon divorced without Gerald's approval, he lost his entire inheritance, millions of dollars. If he left the family business, he lost his stake in the company. And the prenuptial agreement Brandon had convinced Jenna to sign before the wedding, the one Jenna had mentioned casually as just something Brandon's lawyers required, had clauses that heavily favored the Sutherland family. Patricia had gotten a lawyer to review the prenup. If they divorced, Jenna would get almost nothing, even with a child. She'd signed away her rights without understanding what she was agreeing to. Brandon probably hadn't understood either, had just trusted his father's lawyers to handle the paperwork. The more Patricia revealed, the clearer Gerald's strategy became. Had probably planned this marriage carefully, Patricia said. Brandon needed a wife with the right image for the family business. Someone kind and educated and maternal. Jenna fit the profile perfectly. She was likely vetted long before Brandon ever asked her out. The whole relationship might have been engineered from the start. Patricia pulled out another set of photos, and my hands started shaking. They were surveillance pictures Carolyn had taken of Jenna over the past months. Dozens of images showing my daughter at work, at the grocery store, visiting me, meeting friends for coffee. The level of intrusion was chilling. Someone had been watching her every move, documenting her life like she was a subject under investigation. I felt rage building in my chest. How dare Gerald Sutherland treat my daughter like property to be monitored and controlled? But Patricia wasn't finished. She had one more thing to show me. And this was the worst discovery of all. Patricia had managed to access Carolyn Shaw's cloud storage through a contact in the private investigation community. Inside those files was a folder labeled Jenna Contingency. Patricia opened it on her tablet and showed me documents that made my blood run cold. Gerald had already prepared multiple scenarios for controlling Jenna. One document outlined strategies for pressuring her into quitting her nursing job because Gerald wanted her home raising children, not working independently with her own income and identity. Another detailed ways to isolate her from her friends by creating conflicts and misunderstandings. The most chilling document was a draft complaint to the state nursing board with false allegations about Jenna's professional conduct, complete with manufactured evidence ready to be filed if she ever became what Gerald termed a problem. Had pre-planned her destruction, just waiting for an excuse to deploy it. But Patricia had found something even worse. She showed me email exchanges between Gerald and Brandon from the past 6 months. Messages where Gerald gave Brandon specific instructions on how to manage Jenna, when to be affectionate, when to pull back emotionally, how to keep her dependent and compliant. Brandon was following a script his father had written. The marriage itself, the tenderness it observed, even Brandon's excitement about the baby, might all be performances directed by Gerald. I couldn't breathe. My daughter had walked into a trap, and Id helped her do it by approving of Brandon and paying for that beautiful wedding. Id handed her over to a family that saw her as an asset to be controlled, rather than a person to be loved. For 2 days, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Jenna, pregnant with her first child, glowing with happiness, while Gerald Sutherland prepared to trap her in a cage of manipulation and control. I couldn't just tell her the truth. She was in love with Brandon, building a life with him. If I came to her with accusations about his family, she'd think I was trying to sabotage her marriage. She might choose Brandon over me, and then I'd lose any ability to protect her. No. I needed a different strategy. I needed to expose Gerald in a way that protected Jenna and freed Brandon from his father's control at the same time. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized Brandon was as much a victim as anyone else. Had grown up under Gerald's tyranny, watched his brother be destroyed for trying to escape, and learned that obedience was the only way to survive. I called Thomas in Boise and asked if Head helped me fight back against Gerald. There was a long silence on the phone, and I could hear the fear in Thomas breathing. Head spent 5 years rebuilding a life far from his father's reach. Getting involved meant risking everything again. But I appealed to his conscience. Brandon was still trapped, I told him, and now there was a baby coming, Gerald's grandchild, who would grow up under the same toxic control that had destroyed Thomas' life. Did Thomas want another generation poisoned by Gerald's manipulation? Thomas finally agreed to help. He sent me the recording of Gerald and Carolyn via encrypted email. I met with Patricia again, and we brought in her lawyer contact, a man named Samuel Brooks, who specialized in civil rights cases. Samuel reviewed everything we had: the recordings, the surveillance evidence, the files from Carolyn's cloud storage, statements from Thomas and David Thornton about Gerald's past actions. Samuel said, we had enough evidence to file for restraining orders against Gerald and Carolyn, and potentially press criminal charges for illegal surveillance, computer intrusion, and harassment. But he warned that Gerald would fight back with expensive lawyers, and the court case could drag on for years. By the time we won, if we won, Gerald might have already destroyed Jenna's life. Patricia suggested a different approach. We needed to use leverage, force Gerald to back off by threatening public exposure. Wealthy businessmen like Gerald depended on their reputations. If his tactics became public knowledge, his business relationships would crumble, and his carefully constructed image would be destroyed. But we also needed to free Brandon from his father's control. The key to everything was getting Brandon to choose Jenna over Gerald. If Brandon stood with us, if he provided inside information and testified about his father's manipulation, our case became overwhelming. We brought Thomas into a video call to plan strategy. The three of us, plus Samuel Brooks, worked out a multi-pronged approach. First, we'd approach Brandon privately and show him evidence of what his father was doing. We'd give him a chance to break free and protect Jenna himself. Second, we'd prepare a legal package ready to file if Gerald retaliated. Third, we'd document everything, so that if Gerald tried to destroy me or anyone else, we had proof of his tactics. I was terrified of confronting Brandon. If he chose his father over Jenna, if he warned Gerald about what we knew, we'd lose any element of surprise, and Gerald would come after all of us. But Patricia believed Brandon genuinely loved Jenna. She'd seen the way he looked at her in the surveillance photos Carolyn had taken. That love might be real, even if it existed inside a framework Gerald had engineered. I called Brandon and told him I needed to meet urgently. Just the two of us, without Jenna. I said it was about something important he'd discovered and he needed to hear it before anyone else. Brandon agreed to come to my house the next evening. Jenna thought he was helping me with some home repairs. When Brandon arrived, I led him into my living room and sat him down on the couch, where Jenna used to curl up watching television when she was a teenager. Family photos covered the walls around us. Images of Jenna growing up, of Martha before she got sick, of happier times when I thought I understood how the world worked. I looked at Brandon, this young man my daughter loved, and told him I knew about the surveillance. He tried to act confused, started to deny knowing what I meant. So I pulled out my laptop and played the recording of Gerald's meeting with Carolyn Shaw, the one where Gerald calmly discussed destroying what people love to break them permanently. The color drained from Brandon's face. He sat frozen, listening to his father's voice lay out strategies of manipulation and control. When the recording ended, Brandon tried to defend it. He said Gerald was just protective, that running a successful business required being careful about who you trusted. I opened Patricia's folder and showed Brandon the emails she'd found. The detailed instructions from Gerald on how to manage Jenna, when to be affectionate, when to create distance, how to keep her emotionally dependent. Brandon stared at his father's words, seeing his entire marriage reduced to a script he'd been following without fully realizing it. Then I showed him the prenuptial agreement analysis, the trust fund conditions, the contingency files on Jenna, the false nursing board complaint ready to be filed, the systematic plans to isolate Jenna from her friends and pressure her to quit her job. Brandon's hands started shaking. He hadn't known about the complaint, he swore. Had known his father was controlling, but not to this extent. I asked him about Thomas. Brandon's face crumpled and he started crying. He said what happened to Thomas haunted him every day. Had been too afraid to stand up to Gerald, had chosen security over his brother, and he regretted it constantly. But he didn't know how to escape. Gerald's control was total. Brandon's entire life, his money, his career, everything depended on his father's approval. I told Brandon he had a choice, right now. He could be complicit in his father's abuse of Jenna, watch Gerald systematically destroy the woman he claimed to love, raise his child in the same toxic environment that had broken Thomas. Or he could fight back. He could choose his wife and his baby over his father's money and expectations. Brandon said fighting Gerald was impossible. Gerald destroyed everyone who opposed him. I revealed that Thomas was willing to testify about Gerald's past actions, that we had evidence of illegal surveillance and manipulation, that we could protect Brandon and Jenna if Brandon helped us. But I needed him to be brave enough to stand up to his father, to finally do what he should have done for Thomas 5 years ago. Hello, I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together. There was a lawyer named Dennis Harper who handled all of Gerald's delicate situations, the legal threats and settlements, and non-disclosure agreements. But Brandon had access to some of Gerald's computer files through the company network. If he was careful, he could copy them without Gerald knowing. Over the next week, Brandon secretly downloaded files, while pretending everything was normal. Evidence of other people Gerald had threatened or destroyed over the years. Financial records showing payments to Carolyn Shaw for various surveillance jobs. Communications about the spyware installed on Jenna's phone that allowed Gerald to monitor her text messages and emails. Brandon met me and Patricia at a secure location, a storage unit on the outskirts of town where no one would see us together. He brought everything on encrypted thumb drives, his hands shaking as he handed them over. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. The guilt of betraying his father warred with the knowledge that he was doing the right thing. Patricia spent 2 days going through the files Brandon provided. When she called me in, her face was grim. She now had enough evidence to bury Gerald legally. Financial crimes, illegal surveillance, harassment, witness intimidation. Samuel Brooks could build a case that would send Gerald to prison for years. But I didn't just want legal victory. I wanted Gerald exposed publicly. I wanted everyone who did business with him to know what kind of man he was. I wanted his reputation destroyed the way Head destroyed so many others. We kept working, building our case, preparing for the confrontation. Thomas flew in from Boise to add his testimony. Patricia documented everything. Samuel prepared legal filings. And then Brandon discovered something that changed everything. While copying files, Brandon found a folder Head never seen before, labeled Brandon Marriage Project. Inside were documents dating back 3 years, long before Brandon and Jenna even met. Gerald had researched potential wives for Brandon like he was shopping for a business acquisition. Head had Carolyn Shaw create detailed profiles of acceptable candidates, women who fit specific criteria. Jenna had been selected specifically because she was a healthcare worker with a good public image, close to her widowed father, so family loyalty could be used as leverage, financially modest, so she'd be impressed by Sutherland wealth, and had lost her mother young, which meant she might crave family connection and approval. Gerald had literally profiled my daughter and decided she'd be the perfect wife to control. The documents showed Gerald had arranged for Brandon to meet Jenna at a hospital charity event that Sutherland Properties had sponsored. The entire relationship had been engineered from the beginning. Brandon stared at the files in horror, realizing even his love story had been his father's puppet show. But there was more. The files revealed Gerald was planning to force Brandon to pressure Jenna into quitting her nursing job within 6 months of the baby's birth. Gerald had already contacted the hospital administrator, a man who owed Gerald favors from a real estate deal, to create a hostile work environment for Jenna. The plan was to make her job so stressful and unpleasant that she'd quit voluntarily to focus on motherhood. Gerald wanted Jenna completely financially dependent on Brandon, which meant dependent on Gerald. Brandon realized the trap was closing around Jenna, and they were running out of time. His father's plans were already in motion. We had to act immediately. We gathered everyone together for a final planning meeting. Me, Brandon, Patricia, Thomas, and Samuel Brooks via video call. The storage unit felt cramped with all of us there. The fluorescent lights humming overhead, surrounded by boxes of evidence Wed compiled against Gerald Sutherland. Samuel explained that while we could go to the police with the evidence of Gerald's crimes, there was a better approach. Gerald's power came from his reputation and business relationships. If his tactics became public knowledge, his entire empire would crumble. Business partners would distance themselves. Real estate deals would fall apart. Banks would reconsider loans. The court of public opinion could destroy him faster and more completely than any criminal trial. We planned a coordinated strategy. Wed approached Gerald privately with all our evidence and give him an ultimatum. Release Brandon from all financial controls. Destroy all files on Jenna. Cease all surveillance. Allow Thomas back into the family with full restoration of his reputation and financial compensation. Or Wed, go public, and press criminal charges simultaneously. We had 3 different news outlets ready to run investigative stories about Gerald's business tactics. We had former victims like David Thornton willing to go on record. Brandon arranged a meeting at Gerald's office under the pretense of discussing a major business deal. Gerald's assistant scheduled it for a Monday morning, assuming it would be a normal father-son business discussion. Gerald had no idea what was coming. The morning of the meeting, I put on my best suit, the one he'd worn to Jenna's wedding. Thomas flew in the night before and stayed at my house. We barely slept. Brandon picked us up at 8, along with Patricia. The drive to Sutherland Properties downtown felt surreal. We were about to confront one of the most powerful businessmen in Portland, a man who'd destroyed everyone who'd ever challenged him. The Sutherland Properties office took up the entire 10th floor of a glass tower overlooking the Willamette River. Expensive modern furniture filled the waiting area. Gerald's assistant looked confused when she saw Brandon arrive with 3 other people instead of coming alone, but Brandon said we were all part of the business discussion. Gerald's office was designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the city, a massive mahogany desk, leather chairs, awards and photos with politicians and business leaders covering one wall. Gerald stood when we entered, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit. His silver hair, perfectly styled. He smiled at Brandon, then looked at the rest of us with confusion, turning to suspicion. "Brandon, what's this about?" Gerald asked. His voice was smooth, controlled, the voice of a man used to commanding every situation. Brandon's hands shook, but his voice stayed steady. "We need to have a conversation about your activities, Dad. About the things you've done to control people. To control me." Gerald's expression hardened. He ordered us out of his office. We had no appointment, no right to be there, and had call security if we didn't leave immediately. I stepped forward and calmly said we weren't going anywhere until he heard what we had to say. I placed my laptop on his expensive desk, opened it, and started showing him the evidence. The recordings of him and Carolyn Shaw discussing how to destroy Thomas and Laura. The surveillance photos of Jenna. The emails instructing Brandon how to manage his wife. The contingency files with false allegations ready to be deployed. The marriage project documents showing Gerald had selected Jenna like she was a business asset. The financial records of payments to Carolyn for illegal surveillance. Gerald's face cycled through anger, calculation, and denial as we laid it all out. He tried to bluster, saying the evidence was inadmissible, obtained illegally, that he'd sue us for defamation and harassment. He threatened to destroy all of us. That's when Samuel Brooks appeared on my laptop screen via video call. He introduced himself as our attorney and methodically explained that while some evidence might face challenges in criminal court, it was devastating for civil suits and public exposure. We had 3 news outlets ready to run stories. We had multiple victims willing to go on record. We had documented proof of illegal surveillance, witness intimidation, fraud, and harassment. Gerald realized he was trapped. The smooth businessman facade cracked, and I saw the cold, calculating predator underneath. He tried to negotiate, offering money to make everything go away. I refused. "This isn't about money," I said. "This is about freedom for Jenna, for Brandon, for Thomas. It's about making sure you never control another person's life." Thomas stood up and faced his father directly. His voice shook, but he got the words out. "You destroyed my life," he said. "You destroyed Laura's life. You turned Brandon into a puppet. You were planning to do the same thing to Jenna and your own grandchild. You're a monster dressed up as a respected businessman. I'm done being afraid of you. Brandon added that he was choosing his wife and child over the family business and Gerald's money. Gerald threatened to disinherit him completely, to cut him off without a penny. Brandon said he didn't care. He'd rather start over with nothing than continue being Gerald's controlled puppet. I pointed out that Gerald would lose far more than we would if this went public. His business partners would flee once they learned his tactics. His reputation would be destroyed. He might face criminal charges for the surveillance and computer crimes. Had built his empire on a foundation of fear and manipulation, and we were about to expose that foundation to the world. Gerald stared at us with pure hatred, but he was cornered and he knew it. Samuel produced documents Gerald had to sign. Legal agreements that released Brandon from all trust conditions, transferred Brandon's company shares to him free and clear, with no strings attached, required destruction of all surveillance files on Jenna, with verification by an independent third party, imposed restraining orders, preventing Gerald or Carolyn Shaw from contacting Jenna, demanded a public statement restoring Thomas' reputation and clearing his name, and provided financial compensation to Thomas for what had been taken from him. Gerald's hand shook with rage as he read the documents. He looked at Brandon with betrayal in his eyes, looked at Thomas with contempt, looked at me with fury. He signed each page with violent strokes of his pen, knowing he had no choice. When he finished, he threw the pen across his desk and warned us Wed made a powerful enemy. I responded calmly that Wed freed ourselves from a tyrant. There's a difference. The changes didn't happen overnight, but they happened. Brandon worked with lawyers to ensure Gerald complied with every term of the agreement. The surveillance files were destroyed under supervised verification. The restraining orders were filed and approved. Thomas received a settlement and a public statement from Sutherland Properties, acknowledging his wrongful prosecution and restoring his professional reputation. Brandon transferred his company shares to an independent firm and started his own consulting business. Without Gerald's interference, he discovered he was actually skilled at real estate consulting and quickly built a solid client base. He and Jenna moved into a modest 3-bedroom house in my neighborhood, close enough that I could walk to their place in 10 minutes. The hardest part was Brandon telling Jenna everything. He sat her down one evening and explained the surveillance, the manipulation, the way Gerald had engineered their meeting and controlled their relationship. He showed her the contingency files with the false allegations Gerald had prepared. He told her about Thomas and Laura, about the pattern of destruction Gerald had used against anyone who challenged him. Jenna was devastated. She felt violated, knowing Carolyn Shaw had been watching her for months, reading her private messages, photographing her daily life. She was hurt that Brandon had followed his father's instructions on how to manage her, that aspects of their relationship had been scripted. But she was also proud of Brandon for finally standing up to Gerald, for choosing her and their baby over his father's money and control. She came to me crying and angry, asking why I hadn't told her sooner what I'd discovered. I explained that I couldn't come to her with suspicions and theories, that I'd needed solid proof, and that I was terrified of driving a wedge between us if I'd been wrong. She understood, eventually. She forgave me for keeping secrets, because she knew I'd been trying to protect her. Thomas moved back to Portland 2 months after the confrontation. Brandon helped him find an apartment and reconnect with the few friends who'd stood by him after prison. The brothers had long, emotional conversations, years of pain and regret spilling out. Thomas told Brandon he didn't blame him for what happened, that he understood the fear that came with being Gerald's son. Brandon apologized over and over, saying he should have been braver, should have defended his brother instead of choosing safety. Slowly, they rebuilt their relationship. Thomas started attending family dinners at Brandon and Jenna's house. He was cautious at first, damaged by years of betrayal, but Jenna welcomed him with warmth and kindness. She saw the good man underneath the trauma, recognized that Thomas was another of Gerald's victims. I watched Brandon transform over those months. Free from his father's control, he became more confident, more present, more genuine. He made less money than he had working for Sutherland Properties, but he was genuinely happy. He'd come home from work and actually relax, instead of tensing every time his phone rang. He talked to Jenna like a partner, instead of following scripts. He made his own decisions, without checking with Gerald first. Jenna gave birth to a healthy baby girl on a rainy April morning. They named her Martha, after my late wife, and I cried when they told me. I held my granddaughter for the first time in the hospital. This tiny, perfect human with Jenna's eyes and Brandon's chin, and I felt my wife's presence in the room. Id fulfilled my promise to Martha to always protect our daughter, even when that protection meant confronting powerful enemies and risking everything. Patricia Walsh became a family friend. She attended Martha's baptism and brought a silver rattle as a gift. Shed moved on to other cases, but she checked in regularly to make sure Gerald was complying with the restraining orders. So far, Head kept his distance. His business had taken significant hits when several partners quietly ended relationships with Sutherland Properties after hearing whispers about his tactics. Gerald was still wealthy and powerful, but his reputation had cracks in it now, and people were more cautious about dealing with him. 6 months after Martha was born, we all gathered at my house for a family dinner. Me, Jenna, Brandon, Thomas, and Patricia. Brandon grilled burgers in my backyard while Jenna nursed Martha in the living room. Thomas and I set the picnic table and talked about his new job at an accounting firm that had hired him after his name was cleared. Patricia brought a pie and told stories about her FBI days that made everyone laugh. We sat around the table as the sun set over Portland, eating and talking, and watching Martha sleep in her carrier. This was family, I thought. Not the twisted, controlling thing Gerald had created, but real family built on freedom and truth and mutual respect. People who chose to be together rather than being trapped together. After dinner, I held Martha while the others cleaned up. She made little sounds in her sleep. Her tiny fingers curled around my thumb. I thought about everything we'd been through to protect her before she was even born. The investigation, the confrontation, the risks we'd taken. It had been worth it. This child would grow up free from Gerald's manipulation. She'd know her Uncle Thomas and hear the truth about her family's history. She'd learn that her father was brave enough to break free from a tyrant, that her mother was strong enough to forgive and rebuild, that her grandfather loved her enough to fight powerful enemies. I thought about all the lessons this experience had taught me. That protecting the people you love sometimes means making hard choices and taking risks. That evil often hides behind respectability and wealth. That control, masquerading as protection, is still tyranny. That real family is built on freedom and truth, not obligation and manipulation. That standing up to power is terrifying but necessary. Ed learned that my daughter didn't need me to make decisions for her, but she did need me to give her the information to make her own choices. That Brandon wasn't the enemy, but another victim who needed saving. That Thomas' courage in surviving his father's betrayal inspired our victory. That Patricia's skills and dedication proved strangers can become true friends through shared purpose. Ed learned that justice doesn't always come from courts. Sometimes it comes from people refusing to be controlled anymore, from gathering evidence and exposing the truth, from standing together against those who think power makes them untouchable. The legacy Ed leave my granddaughter Martha wasn't money or status. It was the knowledge that her grandfather fought for her mother's freedom before Martha was even born. That love means protecting autonomy, not enforcing dependence. That family ties, based on control, aren't worth preserving. But relationships based on genuine care are worth fighting for. I was grateful Id paid attention to that photographer's call, 1 month after the wedding. Grateful Id trusted my instincts when I saw something wrong in those photos. Grateful I hadn't looked away from the truth even when it was frightening and complicated. My late wife Martha would be proud, I thought. She'd always been braver than me, more willing to confront difficult truths. She'd have approved of how Ed protected our daughter and grandson, how Ed helped free Brandon and Thomas from their father's toxic control. She'd have loved sitting here with this family we'd helped save, holding the granddaughter who carried her name. As the evening darkened and the first stars appeared, I whispered a promise to baby Martha. "You'll grow up free," I told her quietly. "You'll know your worth isn't determined by anyone's expectations or control. You'll learn that your family chose love over power, truth over comfort. Your Uncle Thomas will teach you that survival is possible after betrayal. Your father will show you that breaking cycles of control takes courage. Your mother will prove that strength and gentleness can coexist. And make sure you know that it's never too late to fight for what's right." The sun had fully set now over Portland. Through my kitchen window, I could see Jenna and Brandon washing dishes together, laughing about something. Thomas was showing Patricia photos on his phone, probably pictures of his new apartment. Normal family moments, the kind Gerald had never allowed in his world of control and manipulation. I looked down at Martha, this beautiful innocent child who would grow up protected and free because people had been willing to fight for her. Her little hand squeezed my thumb in her sleep, and I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since before Martha's mother died. Wed won. Wed faced a powerful enemy, and Wed won. Not because we were stronger or wealthier or more connected, but because Wed refused to accept that control was the same as family, that obedience was the same as love. Gerald Sutherland was still out there somewhere in his expensive office, with his diminished empire, nursing his hatred and his wounded pride. But he couldn't touch us anymore. Wed built walls of legal protections and public awareness around ourselves. More importantly, Wed built a real family based on trust and freedom. That was something Gerald would never understand and could never destroy. I stood up carefully, still holding Martha, and walked to the window. My reflection looked back at me. A man, in his late 60s who'd spent his life as a school principal, teaching other people's children. Who'd lost his wife too young, who'd raised his daughter alone and tried his best to protect her. He'd made mistakes along the way, kept secrets when maybe I should have been more open, investigated behind backs when direct conversation might have worked. But in the end, I'd done what needed doing. I'd gathered the truth, built a coalition, confronted power, and freed my family. That was enough. That was more than enough. Martha stirred in my arms and opened her eyes, looking up at me with that unfocused, newborn gaze that still seemed to see into your soul. I smiled at her, and she made a soft, cooing sound. Welcome to a family that chose freedom, little one. Welcome to a life where no one will ever control you the way Gerald tried to control everyone around him. Welcome to the truth, messy and complicated but real. Welcome home. Now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to stand up to someone powerful to protect someone you love? Have you ever discovered that a relationship in your life was being manipulated by someone behind the scenes? What would you do if you found out a family member was being controlled or surveilled without their knowledge? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the difference between control and care, between real family and toxic obligation, please hit that like button. Subscribe to hear more stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges and finding the courage to fight back. Share this story with someone who might need to hear that it's possible to stand up to powerful people, that freedom is worth fighting for, that real love never demands absolute control. Thank you for listening to this story about my family's journey from manipulation to freedom. I hope it reminds you that protecting the people you love sometimes means taking risks, that truth is more important than comfort, and that it's never too late to fight for what's right. May you have the courage to stand up for those who need protection, the wisdom to recognize control, masquerading as love, and the strength to choose freedom over security when that choice matters most. Take care of yourselves and the people you love. And remember, real family is built on freedom and truth, not control and fear.